I'm Nancy Mueller, and I've been involved with science activities now for my second year, and it's just great fun. We've had amazing speakers, every last one of them, all different and all very, very expert at what they do. Today we have Dr. Elizabeth Hadley. She is the director of Jasper Ridge, the Paul S. and Billy Achilles Professor of Environmental Biology, Senior Professor at the Woods Institute, and Professor by courtesy of the Geological Sciences. In her early career, this is very special, Liz searched for wolf bones to use paleontological data to justify the original presence of the apex predator in Yellowstone National Park. The wolf reintroduction reestablished the healthy ecosystem from elk to bison to beaver to the paths of rivers once again. Dr. Hadley was featured in the recent documentary by David Attenborough called Extinction, and she spoke eloquently about the issues of the terribly high numbers of species that are facing extinction. And it was from that documentary that I thought, wow, we need to have Dr. Hadley on board with us on a Zoom call. Dr. Hadley also attends many Stanford alumni travel trips, and she happened to be the professor who was the speaker on the Northwest Passage trip that I took in 2018, I think it was, or 18 or 19, and it was wonderful. So I welcome Dr. Elizabeth Hadley. Thank you for being here, Liz.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can just, you're going to have to make me the host, Nancy. We kind of worked this out. We're like exchanging microphones here. Thank you for that really nice introduction. And I'm going to start by saying that it's odd to be introduced as someone who was featured in a film, but I have to say it was a really, really big honor to be associated with David Attenborough in anything, and so that was pretty awesome. But it's also a really depressing topic, and to be with him for the first time, he really presented dire news instead of his upbeat, wonderful, melodious voice talking about the wonders of the planet was kind of depressing, but also I'm really glad he finally changed a little bit of his message to the one we all really need to hear. So Nancy, how's the host changing going?
Well, it's very strange because it let me do it before, but now it's not letting me do it. That's very strange.
What are you trying to do?
Change the host.
Maybe I have all these screens, these slides I'd like to share.
I know.
And I'm just trying to figure out if there's a way I don't know that I can help here.
I did it before and I
click my name and it says more. And I think you can, under the more, you say, oh, is it giving me you the opportunity to make me co-host?
No, it tells me rename and add profile picture. That's all I get.
Okay, under my name, when you click me.
Oh, under your name.
Yeah, under my name.
Under your name.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just let somebody else in. So under Liz names more.
Yeah.
Make host. Yay! Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so now the responsibility is all mine here.
Okay.
So hopefully we'll be able to kind of get this rolling. Let's get you on the right screen, and hopefully this is my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is not the most upbeat of topics, but there's a message here, and I'm going to continue to kind of share this message as much as I can. So this is an image of some of the birds collected in one day last year, just in an arroyo in New Mexico. And these are all the birds that just basically fell out of the sky. At the time, there were fires burning, and we still don't fully understand why they died. But this is an image that is also something I could have showed you exactly the same thing at the bottom of the skyscraper in New York City at the end of the day, right? So as these birds migrate, these are our migrating songbirds, and you'll recognize if you know anything about birds, these are just kind of common species. And what we're doing, the point of this slide is to really underscore that much of what we do really impacts all the life that we share this planet with. Before Stanford existed, and this is an institution I've been at for about 25 years, the Mwekma Ohlone called the actual area that that I work in, Jasper Ridge National Park, their home. And these are two manos and matates from Jasper Ridge. We still have a very active communication and give and take from this community. We have a celebration of First Nations, usually every fall. And this land is and continues to be super valuable to these people. And so I want to acknowledge the importance of the care that they took, the stewarding that they took. And one of the points of my work is to notice how the care that they took of this land differs from the care since they really left. And then a little bit of my background, and this is a cave that I excavated that served as what Nancy introduced as the source of a lot of wolf bones and elk bones. And this was just my curiosity. I started working in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, and in the early 1980s, 1981. And at the time, it was very controversial about whether elk were native. So this is back to the days of really trying to address how ecosystems work. How do ecosystems work? What's top down? What's bottom up? What's a native species? What's a non-native species? And so, ecology is an old discipline, and yet there was still this lack of understanding about how big ungulates influence plants and whether predators controlled the ungulates or the climate did or the plants did. So I thought, well, the best way of addressing whether or not elk are native to Yellowstone is to excavate a fossil locality. And so I went around and I found one. I found actually several, and through my excavations, I have basically documented that 93% of the extant mammals in Yellowstone are in the sites that I excavated there. And so I have their evidence back in time, and it's a completely novel way of explaining what is native in an ecosystem. But what this means is I have this really kind of very significant, I'm one of the few people that works on this particular time period, just the past few thousand years. I'm sorry for the sun is setting here right behind me and I can't get away from it. The point of this is that without this historic record, you lose the ability to understand the scale of the changes that are confronting us today. And that's one of the biggest messages I have as a paleoecologist. And I'm not going to talk a lot about paleoecology, but I will give you a few examples about why this record of time helps us understand the scale of challenges we're confronting. So this is where I really cut my teeth in, so to speak. I have degrees in anthropology, biology, and climate and geology as well. So I have a very interdisciplinary background, which I use as much as I possibly can. And part of the reason is because the rock record, the way we divide time into these scenes, the epochs and the ages we call the Holocene, Pleistocene, Pliocene, you don't need to worry about these names. But the point here is that, can you see my cursor? No? No, probably not. Okay.
No.
Every one of these on the left side of it, every one of these boundaries that defines the words on the right side are boundaries in life. They're changes in their extinction events or their land exchanges of mammals from between continents, or their evolutionary events where there's some sort of novelty. And every one of these rock designations of time is based on life, something about a change in life. What better way to think about how we have influenced our planet? And so what I want to talk to you today about is about the Anthropocene, which is been proposed to be somewhere around 1950. And so I would venture to say most everyone in this call is either close to an Anthropocene person or we are part of the Anthropocene. So why do we call it the Anthropocene? And it's because of the pervasive and important and significant impacts that humans have on the environment. In fact, we've influenced everything on the planet: the lithosphere, or the rock record, the hydrosphere, or the freshwater and oceanic environment, our water environment, the cryosphere, glaciers and ice on the tops of mountains, permafrost, the atmosphere, of course, we know as the impacts of climate change and pollution, and of course, the biosphere, or life in all ways. My favorite way of thinking about the Anthropocene is that humans, we evolved 200,000 years ago, embedded in nature, with nature in our everyday being. And now nature is embedded in humanity. There isn't a part of the planet that's not somehow influenced by what we do. So the Anthropocene, quite formally, is the period of Earth history, anthro and scene, time, right, that is dominated by human influence of the Earth system processes. We are every bit as large of an impact as the asteroid that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. So what tipped us into this Anthropocene? We did. So in 1950, the age of this kind of major acceleration and change in the planet, there were only 2.5 billion people on the planet. And perhaps, I mean, this is a very difficult conversation to have with some people, but today we have 7.9 billion people. This was as of August 30th. 7.9 billion people on the planet. So, you know, you've definitely seen the number of people double. Everywhere says, oh, these people are moving in. Well, it's because there are more of us and we are influencing everywhere. If you haven't seen UN fertility, UN projections of population, you should take a look at these variants. If we were to stay on our fertility rate, which is about 2.1%, right? 2.1 offspring per couple. That's the constant fertility. We will be, I mean, we can't even imagine being above 25 billion. How can you imagine being above 25 billion people on the planet? No way. So luckily, everybody's fertility rate is declining. Every country's fertility rate is declining, except for really what's happening in Africa. And that's another story for another time. It's where goes Africa, goes the planet. It's a super important thing to recognize. So
Liz,
what's doing this? Yes.
Liz, can I interrupt you just a second? Can you mute everybody except you?
I think I probably can. Let's see.
I can't because I don't have control now.
Maybe if everyone could mute, I have to go out.
Yeah.
I can stop sharing my screen and do it. Oh, wait.
No, don't do that. No, just everybody,
I think I can do it over here if I can find my cursor. Hold on a second. Here we go. Participants.
down at the bottom, it should say mute all, and then you unmute yourself.
I can hear it. Mute. Sorry, this cursor is audio settings. What's the?
That's right. It looks to me like our team is really helping out, and looks
Thank
like
you.
everybody's muted.
Oh, here we go. Mute all. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Hopefully you can still hear me. Can you still hear me? Okay, great. And feel free to interrupt somehow if you want to. Thank you for doing that. So anyway, what tipped us into this? So clearly it has to do with the number of people we have. And of course, climate change, invasive species. We've transformed more than 70% of our land. Some people say it's more than 75% of our land. Why? Because we are using it. We're using it for our food and for the production of food for our crops. I mean, food for our animals and for our living spaces. We have transformed the land. We also have input a tremendous amount of pollution and a number of toxins. And of course, then we have lost a lot of species, a lot of organisms. I'm going to touch on all of these very, very briefly. It's obviously a big topic, but I also want to say that the other things that influence how we go forward and the extreme impacts of the Anthropocene right now are the social inequities we have, not just in our country, but around the world. The difference between the haves and the have-nots is just remarkable. And of course, our changing norms, what we think is acceptable, what we wear, what cars we drive, whether we have a cell phone or not. Do we need a new cell phone every year or not? The changing norms are super important, and they influence this race we have against our planet. One of the most important things to consider is this time scale. And I recognize there's a lot on here. I want you to follow me and read on the x-axis. So the horizontal axis, it starts at 5 million years ago before present, and we're going to end up 100 years in the future. But there's a scale change. Every vertical line is a scale change. So we go millions of years to thousands of years to years before present, and then years into the future. Okay, so every one of these is a scale change. On the y-axis is basically temperature, and these come from a variety of proxies. So most of what you see through the Pleistocene and the Pliocene for the past several million years is from ice records. And then we get into the Pleistocene, and there's this, what you're seeing is the unpacking of all those major squiggles up and down. Those are the interglacials as you go above the zero temperature line, 0 degrees, and then they're glacials as you go below that. So we go warm, cool, and those cycles, they're depending on where you are between 17 and 21 of those in the Pleistocene. Those are the glacial cycles we see on the planet. Then we go into what's called the Holocene, okay? About 10,000 years ago, the -10, and all of those different colored lines are different kinds of proxy records for temperature. So we have a global reconstruction, but they're dependent upon things like deep sea cores, ice cores, lake records, speleothems in caves, peat bogs, tree rings, all sorts of things. So, and then even historic records. And so just be aware that all of these records kind of converge on what is extremely constant temperature. The Holocene is the period of time where we started to domesticate crops, we domesticated animals, and great civilizations were built on all of our continents. That was enabled by being able to say what happened yesterday is what's going to happen tomorrow. Last October is what we can use to predict next October. And that planning, that stability in the environment is what us allows to become sedentary instead of moving around with climate change. Then we get into this period of time where we're basically entering into the latest Holocene, and then we get into the last century, then 50 years ago, and bang, look at our temperatures. They start to just take one giant leap. The important thing for this historic scale is that if you look at the red curve and it says 2100, Earth has not been this hot in 14 million years. There's not even a time period on this graph that takes you to the more than 2 degrees that our temperature is projected to increase if nothing changes. Even the 2-degree increase, we haven't really seen that for quite a while. And the important thing to note is that it's certainly not in our, by the way, in our lifetime as humans. And the important thing since we're such a baby mammal species, we're only around 200,000 years old. If you go back to most animal species that we know and love, they're at least 2 to 3 million years old. The rodents, horses are even older. I mean, think about that these animals that we're familiar with and many plants we're familiar with have never seen the climates nor the rate of change that we're headed for. When did this begin? And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's something special about the year 1950, and I'm going to tell you what that special thing is, but I really loved this narrative by one of our collaborators, which is the House of Culture in Berlin. It's funded by the German government, and it's mostly an art humanities museum. But they've been collaborating with us on trying to describe what the Anthropocene is in this humanistic frame. The year 1948 serves as an aperture through which we can rethink the history of now, the decisive moment when the heap of fragments left by the fury of 2 world wars began to reassemble into new forms of technological, scientific, and cultural order that inform our contemporary situation. With the atomic age, I'll come back to this, the digital age and the age of hydrocarbon man taking off, 1948 represents an inflection point for many developments and path dependencies to come. In fact, 1948 is 1 year of recomposing not only the world, the modern project of techno-cultural and geopolitical design, but the planet. The technosphere is mobilized, and with it we enter the Anthropocene. This is no longer just the Northern Hemisphere or the Western civilization. This is a global phenomenon. I think this is quite a beautiful way of thinking about this horrifying time. Well, what happened? There are many, many of these, and these are some of the most profound inflection points. You look at the record from 1750 to 2010, and there are many records, but look at what's kind of happening in most of these indicators right around 1950. There is an inflection point where we go from kind of a gradual increase to a much steeper increase. And I'll tell you, this is not just these kind of arbitrary things. It's also things like the number of McDonald's on the planet. The production of anthropogenic materials accelerated. These are things that did not exist in nature that we created. Aluminum, concrete, plastic, synthetic fibers, they all start rapidly increasing. That increase tends to be associated with what's known as the Great Acceleration. Again, really associated with a technological impact that becomes global in its use, its synthesis, and its record. The Anthropocene is also what's known as the Great Acceleration. And you can see in Western Europe and the Western offshoots, including North America, we dramatically have increased the number of dollars that are devoted to these massive changes in our GDP. So the scale is off here, but I do want to say that these are, again, not really matched by what's happening in Africa. Super, super important. They have not only experienced the benefits of the Great Acceleration, which has arguably made our lives so much more wonderful, our lifespan has increased, but they also are poised at the brink of a massive change in their population. So now this is a little bit of an esoteric section, but I want to tell you this because there is sometimes pushback on what the Anthropocene is. And here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack the big A versus little a. So we can say Anthropocene and just kind of casually use it as the age of man. And we can say, oh, we've been influencing something about the planet, just like every species does, since we arrived as a species, since we left Africa, since we colonized the world. There's all sorts of ways to think about that. But in fact, there are formal ways. This is, again, something perhaps you didn't know, but formal ways of recognizing an age, an epoch, a time period in this rock record. So that's the big A Anthropocene. And the way these formal procedures go is they have to go through what's called the International Union. And in this case, it's the International Union of Geological Sciences. There's ones for conservation of nature. There's what you have to go through these rules in order to name new species, for example. So a new age takes some work. Within that, there are these boundaries. Okay, this is an elaborate history of life on the planet. Okay, this is billions of years of life history. But I want you to see, first of all, it's a ton of time, right? And I want you to see the red letters on the left, GSSP. This is a global boundary stratotype section and points. This is something that you have to be able to point to with your finger on a physical, usually rock unit. The only exception to that I know of is an ice an ice core, which is what helps us define the Pleistocene, but or the difference between the different Pleistocene ages. But anyway, you have to be able to point to this thing. And so in order for us to say, oh, the Anthropocene is 1948, or is it 1950, we have to be able to point to something that is present in the rock record and that is global. So it has to be almost instantaneous when you're thinking about just something that happened a few decades ago. So this is, again, is through the International Union of Geological Sciences within the Commission on Stratigraphy. And then we have this GSSP marker, and every one of those golden spikes, every one of those arrows you see on the underneath the GSSP red arrow, every one of those has a golden spike that you can point to in the rock record. So there's some, so it's not the time that matters, it's the golden spike. And our time resolution varies depending how good our reconstruction of time is, mostly based on radioactive decay. So the point here is that the rock unit is really based on these stratigraphic differences, normally because of something in life, and almost always something you can point to with your finger in a place in the world. So within the Quaternary, which is the last 2.5 million years, so you can look over here in the third column in from the left, you see the Quaternary. That's just a tiny portion of this big record, 2.7 million years. And then again, we go kind of all the way from 2.7 million years at the bottom here up to 0. I know you probably can't see the numbers. That's not really important. The point is that not only do we have this particular event that you point to, but then there's a lot of correlated events that happen. So we're not defining the Pleistocene based on whether it's a polar normal or a polar, some maximum, some sort of change in the polar field, or whether or not there's a planktonic form here or not here. These are all correlated with what we know of in the fossil record. And so it allows you then to kind of expand your understanding of where the boundaries are between these time units around the world, depending on how they're correlated. So it's a lot of work, but it's very important when you're trying to understand time. I'm almost done with this section. I know it's kind of esoteric, but I wanted to really get you to realize that this is what I'm about to tell you is kind of exciting. So this is then for the golden spikes in the Quaternary period. Here, what you see are the ages that have been come up. These are on the very left side are the stages, then the ages, which is the numerical age. And as I said, that varies depending on how well they're dated. And then where is the location with the actual latitude and longitude? What is the boundary level? So it has to be described and clearly pointed to. And then what are the things that are correlated with it? And then we say, what is the status of it? Has it gone through this approval? Where was it published? And this then becomes a very important way to communicate the significance of different terms we use to describe essentially biotic events in the fossil record. So the Anthropocene has been proposed as a formal stratum. We go through this process of announcing it and saying it is distinct from the time that came before it, which is known as the Holocene. We are no longer in the Holocene, is what this proposal says. And in fact, we have a marker for it. So even though this particular signature isn't really the signature that necessarily caused everything else we see as drivers of change, it is actually a ubiquitous, it's global, it's almost instantaneous. And in fact, it really is indicative of this technosphere, this massive production of artificial kinds of human-made items. And it's basically radiogenic fallout. So atmospheric testing is global, and it is a really big deal. So the Anthropocene Working Group in the subcommission said, should we be treat this as a formal unit? The answer is yes. So it was a majority vote. And should it be sometime somewhere in the middle 1900s, around 1950? The answer is yes. So now we're in this process of basically evaluating sites. There is a hunt for the best golden spike. And I want to point out the blue circle surrounded by red. Jasper Ridge on Stanford lands is one of these golden spike localities. this is the most exciting, I think it's one of the most exciting things I've ever worked on. And I'm really proud to be, working on this with my colleagues. And so it's there are several of these will not make it. There's a couple of more that have been proposed, but there are basically 10 sites around the world that are being proposed as this golden spike. And so California, for many reasons, is ideal. It's, there's local impacts of the Anthropocene, regional and global impacts. It's the largest in terms of population, the largest US state, and it's 35th in terms of population out of 195 countries in the world. Kind of amazing. We also show this inflection point, kind of more or less around 1950, like the rest of the world. So do we preserve the golden spike? And the answer is yes. So for those of you who haven't been to Jasper Ridge, I encourage you to sign up for a tour, and we can tell you a lot more about it. It's super exciting. So what you'll see on the left is Jasper Ridge's placement on Stanford lands. It's to the far west of Stanford lands, and it's bordered by Woodside and Portola Valley. And it contains a dam. And the dam was built in 1891. And that dam was built actually to supply San Francisco with water. It was built by Spring Valley Water Company, but it turned out that the water was really muddy. The reason why the water is really muddy is because the San Andreas Fault goes right through Jasper Ridge. And the sediments that come down from the Santa Cruz Mountains right above that and through that fault are just basically fault gouge. They're where the land is kind of, moved across each other. And it's just, these are old oceanic sediments, they fall apart. And so Searsville Lake is filling up with silt. So it turns out it was not potable. They didn't want it. And we got lucky, and Stanford purchased this land to be part of his giant 8,000 some acres. So we have a lot of sediment there. And now this quest to find the Anthropocene is taking place at Jasper Ridge. So this is a picture of us coring a couple of years ago. And I'll tell you, the core we got is amazing. So we actually have 11 cores, and this is just one core. The top is over somewhere above 289 centimeters over on the left. And it goes kind of up and down all the way across to 1,140 centimeters. And it's not bioturbated. It's not mixed up like most lake bottoms are. There's not a lot of stuff going on down there. It's very anoxic, meaning void of oxygen. And those purple and yellow layers you see, this is a CT scan. What they're showing you is differences in the density of the sediment. So yellow is very dense. That means sands. And purple is really, really light. That means organics. What you're seeing is seasonal deposition at Jasper Ridge. This is, on average, we have somewhere between 5 and 10 centimeters per year. That means we can go in and reconstruct, in some cases, individual storm events. This is like a tree ring record, only from a lake. It is unbelievable. I have never seen a core like this, and it's very exciting. We're doing a lot with it. So I'm going to give you a little snapshot about what we're doing, and then I'm going to get into the biodiversity part of this. So the cool thing is that all these signatures that I described to you about, all these drivers, are right here in our backyard. We have this incredible stratigraphy. We have records of these novel materials like this SCP. This is a spheroidal carbonaceous particle, and it is only produced by fossil fuel burning. It's at super high temperatures. And you can see on the bottom, that is the presence from greater than like 1,100 centimeters all the way up to around 200 centimeters on the x-axis. What you see is prior to around 1940, there aren't any of these things. And so suddenly we get evidence of coal and of intense burning right here in our backyard. Now, the important thing here to note is that this isn't local. These are global particles. We don't have anything downwind of us at Jasper Ridge except the Pacific. So there are no big coal-fired plants on the top of the Santa Cruz Mountains. So these particles are coming from across the Pacific Ocean. This is likely signatures from Asia. We have geochemical signals. We have, I'm not going to show you all of these, but every one on this list, we have evidence of heavy metals, of organic chemicals, of the radiogenic fallout, i.e. cesium and americium. We have changes in the carbon and nitrogen isotopes and prevalence through time. And then we have evidence of biology. And I want to get a little bit more into that. So one of the things that's correlated with biodiversity decline is toxins. And this is some of the, super exciting data that's come out of this. On the left side, what you see is mercury contamination in California. And you see a combination of two things. In gold, our gold mines, our gold, they're gold mines, they're placer mines. These are the remnants of what the gold rush did in the middle 1800s, 1850s, what the gold rush did to California, okay? And how did they do that? How did they extract those precious metals, silver and gold? Well, they used mercury. And where did they mine the mercury? In the coast ranges. Our coast ranges are this, they've been pushed up from the deep sea and they have very unusual chemicals. So mercury mines, so think about the Mercury News, the new Almaded mine, it's called that because of cinnabar or mercury. So our mines for mercury are pretty much on the coast, and that mercury then was grabbed by the tons and taken up to the Sierras. Now, mercury is a toxic forever chemical. Once it gets into the system, it doesn't go away. And most of you have heard about the accumulation of mercury probably in your seafood, like swordfish, sharks, tunas. Those are top predators in the ocean. And so they, as you go up through this aquatic system, the aquatic food web, you get more and more mercury. My graduate student, Sergio Redondo, has now looked at the Upper Lake core, which goes back 1,500 years. It's also in Jasper Ridge, and the Searsville core, which goes back to about 1892, right when we built the dam. And there is a doubling in mercury content coming down this drainage and coming from the atmosphere. And that indicates not what's happening in the drainage locally, that is a global phenomenon. In the atmosphere, our atmospheric input since around the late 1800s is 2.5 times what it used to be. And we're headed for even more, because it turns out most of this mercury, again, this is his PhD thesis, which he's in the process of wrapping up, but most of this mercury that comes through the system gets stored in vegetation. And now every time we have these massive fire events, guess what gets released? So our atmospheric mercury is about ready to go up yet again. So Searsville also records local activities, and discriminating local versus global is a super important thing. But here we have an evidence from one of these cores that's of around 500 centimeters, and it's a spike in copper. Well, it turns out that copper is used both in pesticides and in algicides. And what you're seeing down here in this picture of Searsville Lake, it's Searsville Reservoir, is something called parrotweed, which is an invasive plant. And it's, people used to swim in this lake, maybe some of you did, and they don't like this weed. And so the people would come in and sometimes churn it up physically, but they also treated it with a lot of algicides. They've also treated the lake many times with pesticides to try and get rid of mosquitoes, for example. And many of these are loaded with copper. And so we're in the process of trying to understand a little bit more about this local treatment. But boy, you can imagine the fact that we have a record of this is really incredible. So we're now in the history records of correspondence to try and understand it. And then we also have an amazing record of invasions. So this, for example, is the brown bullhead. It's a non-native species that was introduced to Searsville Lake, and we've gotten it through environmental DNA. And so this is the big push that our lab is going for now. We're looking at invasive mosquitoes. We're looking at all sorts of invasive species, plants and animals both, as a way to understand what can we learn from this change in biodiversity over time. So let me come back to what drives the Anthropocene. I've talked about virtually all of these things, but I want to focus a little bit more on biodiversity loss. That's really the rest of the topic for today. And I want to say that, boy, biodiversity loss comes from all of these other drivers of the Anthropocene, okay? population growth, land use change, invasive species, et cetera, et cetera. All of that leads to loss of biodiversity. But one of the big things we do is we actually are pretty good at harvesting animals, every last one of them. So we overexploit things. That means we will deliberately go out and get the last old growth tree or the last tiger or the last elephant on a landscape. We are very good at finding the last ones. We are clearing land everywhere for more agriculture to feed ourselves, developing invasions and disease. I think species have more problem to fear from disease from us than we do from them. We're getting closer and closer to them, and that proximity is causing a lot more problems between us. And as we get closer and closer to them, when we modify that land, we isolate populations from each other, so they can no longer move in response to changing environments. They can no longer get out of our way. Once you lose a pocket gopher in the middle of Stanford lands, you don't get it back. You know, hard to imagine, but it's true. Perhaps that's not the best example for many of you because you want to get rid of gophers in your gardens, but it's really hard to get some of these species back once you plow them or put roads up or, you know, cover them with concrete. So our charismatic animals are being lost rapidly. And I like to talk about mammals because, first of all, I've worked on mammals for my entire career, but also because most people know what they are and they care about these furry things with big eyes that are a lot like us. We've lost a tremendous number of species, and about 1 in 4 mammals are threatened right now with extinction. Even birds. So this is from the IUCN bird species that have changed category. So the least concern, those are the species we don't have to worry about, and near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and extinct in the wild, for example, or extinct totally. More species of birds have moved from a least concern or a lower category of concern to a higher level of concern than the opposite. What we want to see is a lot more bird species moving off these endangered or vulnerable populations up to less and less concern. And it's not going in that direction. And this is just from 1998 to 2016. This is another thing that's underappreciated. This is all the kingdoms of life here. And what you see in these numbers are gigatons of mass. So most of the mass on the planet is vegetation. It's mostly plants, but it's also really small. So bacteria, even though you can't see it, weighs a lot when you combine all the bacterial cells we have on the planet. And animals are a very tiny percentage of this overall biomass. And then when you get into animals, most of them are the crawly things, the crabs, the spiders, and a lot of them are oceanic actually. And so when you get into thinking about wild mammals, go down there to that lion, they are now a very, very tiny percentage of biomass. Even if you add wild birds together, those two together don't even come close to reconstructing the weight, for example, the mass of humans, not even close to the mass of our livestock. So we are replacing all of this wild animal, not just wild mammal, but wild animal biomass with ourselves and with those animals that we eat or like to have near us. The other thing to note is these, as smaller and smaller the total biomass on the planet, the fewer individuals there are. And so this is another thing that's happening is the wildlife populations, those animals, this is based on about 4,000 species from 1970 to 2016. But those wild animal populations, so the numbers of populations and the size of those populations is declining. It's declined by more than half in just this short period of time. Why does that matter? That matters because the smaller the populations, the more likely those populations are to go to extinct, just because of probability. So what you see on the left side is a population size. It's just starting off with this random drift back and forth in population size, big, low, big, low. And as soon as these populations get down to the lower part, like in this case, it's showing at about 1,000, population size of 1,000. A lot of these lines just go down to 0. they go extinct. They don't recover because populations that are small, we can talk about genetic diversity, but this isn't even related to that. It's just based on the stochastic probability that you're going to have a generation or two where there's not a lot of reproduction and you can't replace yourself. These kinds of features are really working against biodiversity survival. And the other thing that's poorly appreciated, and this is from Botswana, and this picture shows basically elephants, and they look happy, but look at this landscape, okay? So there are trees in here that the elephants really like, and you can see the acacias kind of in the background. The bottom of the acacias has been really shaped by elephant browsing on those acacias. They like them. And some of the trees in the foreground are not really ones they like. They don't really have, they have toxins and they have a lot of thorns and they are just not the kind that they like. But the other thing you see is a lot of elephant dung. Elephant dung turns out to be super important for fertilizing the soils. It has a lot of microbes. It actually is a home to many, many insects, and it serves as a way to recycle the plants these guys love. So elephants are both, they're called ecosystem engineers, and their ability to move around they create trails for other species. They change the succession of plants. And in the forest, the forest elephants actually farm the fruiting trees they love because they go around and they defecate these big seeds out. And they create more and more along their paths. You find the trees elephants love to eat with those big fruits on them. In the savannas, the elephants push down and move trees, and in so encouraging the opening of the landscape and fostering a huge diversity of antelope, for example. Elephants are really critical ecosystem engineers, but as their populations decrease, their ability to influence this ecosystem and the ecosystems in the Congo, for example, declines immensely. And so I want you to understand that it's not just the extinction of the animal. I can't imagine a life without, I can't imagine a world without an elephant. It almost brings me to tears to think of it. I love these animals so much. They teach us so much. But I'll tell you, it's the loss of them as major functional units of the ecosystem that we are forgetting about. This loss is really important. Now I want to, I'm kind of starting to wrap up, and I want to say that in our backyard, in our very own backyard, we have a crisis. This is an extraordinary view of the Carrizo Plains a couple of years ago. This is one of the super blooms there, and I've never seen anything so sublime in my life. I mean, this is a phacelia. This is a native plant. It's interspersed with these different yellow flowers. There were orange poppies everywhere. It was just a stunning thing. But you know what? I saw one butterfly, and I saw no bees. Purple is the color that bees love. Where were the insects? I felt like it was wonderful. It was incredible. You could walk anywhere. And I remember when I was a kid, I couldn't walk through flowers without stepping on a bee. So I have to say that as beautiful as this is, there's something really wrong with this picture. And I'm sure you have heard about right now, right here, the loss of the monarchs, the Western monarch, its independent trajectory. They're fostered and overwinter in Monterey. Some of them go to Mexico, but these monarchs, in just a few years, these monarchs have crashed 99%. There's a big group at Jasper Ridge assembling to try and even count the ones we have. Do you see them breeding? Do you see them on their host plants? Should we plant more host plants? There is an effort to try and do what we can. I don't know if we can bring the monarchs back because their populations are small, but I will tell you, we are trying to do more about understanding this phenomenon, and it's called the insect apocalypse. This is the kind of extinction that most people don't know much about. This is the extinction that is essentially the foundation for not just biodiversity, but us as humans. It's not just important for pollination of our crops, but the insect decline is super important for our songbirds, for our bats. It is critically important for decomposition, for the food web and the predation that goes on among other organisms, for pathogens and disease. Insects are so important for functioning of ecosystems. And we are really trying hard to understand. And we're using that core. We're trying to understand a little bit more through the use of the core about what happened and when, and can we describe this in our own backyard? In some parts of the world, there's been a 75 to 80% decline in insects over just the past 20 years. So there are plans to restore biodiversity, and they basically involve kind of counteracting those big drivers I talked about at the beginning. And in my mind, one of the best signatures of the reversal, or maybe the optimistic part of defining the Anthropocene, would be if we could rescue biodiversity. Because if we can, it means we've created a thriving planet for ourselves as well. We have to protect land, obviously, and wild areas, but it's not just in the wild areas where wildlife is. It's in farming environments. It's in cities. We need to create more urban biodiversity, and not just a tree here and there that looks pretty, but trees that serve as food for plants and animals, that serve as space. We need corridors, not barriers, for wildlife to move in and around, and we need more appreciation of that. Of course, we have to protect marine habitats and safeguard the quality of our water. I mean, water is more valuable than almost anything right now. And it's a remarkable thing to think of. I mean, I've spent time, I don't know if any of you have spent time in India, where if you go in India and you go to an apartment building, the water is locked up. Why is it locked up? Because if you do not lock it up, it will be stolen. Pumping it up to those tanks takes power. The power is only on part of the day. So you have to plan when you get more water. It is excruciatingly valuable there. And so much of that population can live without gas. They don't need cars. Many of them do it all on foot, but still water is critically important. And of course, we have to reduce the impacts of climate change, reduce our waste and change our food. And we have to think about our backyards and wildlife as part of our survival, not just ours for the taking. The other thing that's happening very locally is the 30 by 30 protection. And I'm not sure if you guys have heard about this. This is another area where I'm really trying to be actively involved with the state. But the 30 by 30 was proposed as a way to protect 30% of our lands and seas by the year 2030. That's coming up. And California was the first state to do this in the country. This leadership, it's been talked about for a while, but it actually was signed into law by Newsom last fall. And so the state is rapidly, under the leadership of Wayne Crowfoot, is rapidly trying, and Jennifer Norris is trying to figure out how to do this, and is trying to engage with people, with citizens in this state, to figure out what to do and how to value this. But the country has signed on to this too. Joe Biden has signed on to this. Other countries are signing on. It is now a topic of conversation around the world. And so, as per usual, California's leadership is really making a difference. And I think we have a lot to do to exemplify how this could work. Talking to our neighbors who farm timber, to our neighbors who are First Nations, to our neighbors who are the open space, our big NGOs. I mean, this is a way to think about how to talk across those difficult boundaries that really stall us in action. And so I'm quite proud of this. And I'm not saying that 30% is enough. I don't even know if it is, but we have to start somewhere, and this is just a way to pin it. And so, you know, in conclusion, I'll just say our fate is linked to the fate of the planet. And it's really, I mean, I'm sure you've heard these talks before, but I guess I'm going to underscore what everyone else says. It's really in our hands. We are the Anthropocene. We have these toxins in our bodies. We have the storage of mercury, of PCBs, of DDT. We have the food that's been farmed off the lands around us. That created ourselves. We are the Anthropocene. And the question now is, can we use this Anthropocene to make a good ending, to make a good future, and one that we really want? And with that, I will thank you and conclude. And should I stop sharing my screen? Perhaps I will. Nobody can talk because I've muted you all, correct?
Thank you, Liz.
You're welcome.
Wow. I think that was the most honest presentation I've ever heard about the state of our world.
Oh.
And Liz, you are an amazing scientist. You have the proof of the pudding, and we are fortunate to have you doing what you do.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Nancy and Linda. I mean, I'm really honored to be here, and I know everyone always tells me to say something positive, and I try and wrap it up with the fact that we do have our fate in our hands, but wow, it's tough. It's a tough message. I'm sorry.
There's a question here in the chat that Linda has posed. How do your students feel about this? What is the younger generation barometer?
Okay, so I'm going to make you a host again, just so you can follow those questions. How do they feel? Well, they're depressed. We talk about it. I call myself the lab, or our lab is the lab of the Anthropocene. And if you guys ever want to come and see what that is like, I welcome you to ask me, and I could invite you to a lab meeting. It's a very different lab. We encourage a diversity of perspectives. So there are people working on mercury, and there are people working on bones, and somebody else is working on elephants in Africa. I mean, it's a very diverse group, but we're all focused on what can we learn about what we're doing, and how can we make a little adjustment to do something better. I ask all my undergrads and grad students, when they say they're interested in coming in my lab, I say, do you know what the Anthropocene is? Do you care about it? And the amazing thing at Stanford is that I have really shifted my lab beyond what my department really aspires to be, which is a biology lab that goes out and describes biological processes, ecological processes, evolutionary processes. But what I do is focus on not just the stuff that's curious, that drives me to be, I mean, not just the stuff that kind of I know and love, but actually what matters. What can I work on? What can we work on as a group that matters for this question about the impacts of the Anthropocene? So I would say my lab is unified in that way. And so they all are encouraged that they're working on the right questions at the right time. And often that personal awareness of what am I doing and why am I doing this confronts students. It's very typical. Sometimes it happens as an undergrad, sometimes as a grad student, sometimes as a postdoc, and sadly, sometimes even as a professor. But my students don't go through that because they're working on the application of their knowledge to real world problems. Great question, though.
That is awesome. So much of, well, to have work that is being done to be applied, I think is really, really important. There are other, deep research and blah, 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 just for the sake of research is one thing, but to be able to say you are applying this and you are making a difference, which you are. So we can all cry over it, but that doesn't get us anywhere. And you are taking the challenge on at Liz, and it's very, very impressive.
Welcome to the community. We all have to do it together.
Yeah. As you were talking, my brain was going to, what was the effect of the 2 big nuclear bombs that we dropped on Japan? Is that showing itself in any strong suit somewhere?
So actually so which particular spike in our radionuclide record corresponds with which radioactive, nuclear explosion? We haven't gotten to that detail. And I don't know if we will. I'm sure we're curious about it. There are actually some things that I didn't talk about that show some kind of military action in the area that was trying to test out things. And that'll be an interesting story to reveal. But those nuclear explosions, they are really cumulative. Have you guys seen the video of nuclear explosions through time? If
No.
you haven't, Nancy, I can send it to you later if you haven't seen it. It's just it'll amaze you. It starts off boom, boom, and then the whole world gets involved, and it's just it's an incredible, incredible video.
Please do that, and I'll share it with the team.
Yeah, I'll share it with you. And I guess what I would say is that the number of nuclear tests is amazing. It really peaked around the 1960s, and then declined. And of course, it had a slow burn up until World War II, and then it just, skyrocketed. But the reason why I think those are important is even though by itself a nuclear fallout didn't cause this huge Anthropocene change, first of all, it's a real marker of it. Why do we want to destroy other people? Whether or not there's boundaries or not, why do we want to? It's because somehow we want what they have, or we want to make sure they don't take what we have. It's all about resources and protection of those resources, or getting as much as we can. Why do you get more? Because you have to somehow feed and clothe and create a place for your citizens to thrive. And so, that's how we create boundaries between people. And that's what's happening in the Anthropocene, is more and more animosities, because our resources are becoming more and more limited. And we have more and more of us on the planet. So we have larger, small groups than we used to. And so I think it's a real symptom of the Anthropocene, even though it's not necessarily the cause of it. But it's a great marker because it shows up everywhere, including in tree rings.
Oh, wow. Are there any other questions? Please just offer them directly now, or raise your hand, I'll call you. Yes, Linda.
I want to know if you coined golden spike because you're at Stanford and that's where it is.
So you are dead on. This is one of the coolest things that we got to highlight a couple of weeks ago when we went to this big working group meeting about the Anthropocene. As we said, we claim it. Our Leland Stanford drove it in. We have it. I know. It's so perfect. It's so harmonic. And so, I don't know how convincing it was to the committee we have to present our paper next summer. And so we're frantically trying to get everything wrapped up. And oh my gosh, the records we have are just stunning. But there are some other stunning records in the world too. And so there's a little bit of a competition, and I certainly hope we win just because of that. I mean, the golden spike, for gosh sakes. And I think there's also this really important message in the fact that it is humans trying to supply water to San Francisco, during the gold rush, right? That built that darn dam, which now we've curated our own sediment and our own atmospheric and water waste. We've curated that, we created it. And so to me, there is nothing better than that. It's not like a cave speleothem or a Baltic Sea. I mean, we have created our own, what's that called? A time capsule. Yeah. That's what this is.
Fantastic.
Well, I'd love to do a field trip with you to Jasper Ridge.
Oh, I'd love to take you. I'd love to take you, Linda.
We did one a few years ago, actually, and it was a wonderful field trip. Be really fantastic to do another one now, given all this new knowledge.
We will take.
It's a hard thing to think about what we're preserving there. What are we preserving? Is there a way to go back? And the answer is no. There's no baseline that we can go back to. So we really try and say we're trying to preserve the process and make our best guess about how to make this place resilient for biodiversity in the future. And it might involve some pretty radical things. We're trying to get Thule elk reintroduced there.
Great.
It would help us with our fire fuels. So there's all sorts of things we're thinking about that are a little different. What do we do in a preserve? It's tiny, but what do we do to keep biodiversity going strong?
Well, I think today too, in the news, there were two stories, one about 7 wolf pups being killed in Idaho that were being followed by a high school, and they just went and eliminated them because they killed 150 animals when there are 200,000 sheep and cattle and something in Idaho. There was the wolf story, and then there was also the story about the Aborigines in Australia, whose forest has been returned to them because the government of I've never been there, Nancy. I'll bet you have because you died there. The forest that's near the Great Barrier Reef, and
near Cairns.
Yeah, it must be near Cairns. Yeah,
near Cairns,
I don't know the forest in particular.
There, yeah, it's near the tablelands.
The government actually returned the forest to the Aborigines who've been looking after it for 70,000 years because it's very clear that they were doing a terrible job, and the Aborigines would do better. And the state park superintendent, who I met a couple of weeks ago at Big Basin, was there with the leader of a major tribe that had once lived in the forest, and they're working with him to
Wonderful.
see what they can do to bring their knowledge back to that. To
There is a really interesting, I found out about a group in California that is led, it's a Native American committee that guides people on the early practices of burning. And so I've just learned about it. The state has engaged them to think about how can we think differently about, prescribed burns. And then have you guys read about New Zealand and their recognition of mountains and rivers as individuals?
Oh, no.
So this is a super important thing because all of our philosophy, so our laws are based on Greek philosophy, right? Which is very male and very human centered. And, protection and laws are all about people and property. And this is a very big difference. And it is much more animist, right? It's that a mountain has standing in the law. A river has standing. It should be recognized as a person. So it's like a personhood recognition. It's quite beautiful, and I encourage you to look it up. It's really beautiful. Many cultures have this kind of view.
Right.
Indigenous, I think. Can you hear me? This is
Yes, I can.
I think it's an indigenous thing too. Certainly other continents have it, and the more populated places do not.
It's certainly true in Kenya. Mount Kenya is revered by the Maasai as a sacred mountain, and it has its name. But I just hope it's not too little too late.
Well, I have to say that I think the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of the, cultural recognitions of First Nations has really kind of come into its own. Now the land acknowledgement, which I had at the beginning, is more and more part of what everyone does when they give a talk. And part of that is, hey, it's not just, hey, you used to have it and now it's ours. It is, there were people here before us. And whether or not they did it in the right way or the wrong way, or it was perfect or not, is not up for debate. It's just recognition that people were here before we claimed it as ours.
Yes.
And learning from those people is really important, just like learning from a diversity of people on a panel or from around the world. I think diversity is the only way out of this, better communication and basically breaking down barriers between people, not installing them.
How many groups are there that are studying this? I mean, you have a competition coming. How many are in it?
So there are, I think right now, like I said, it kind of changed because one was added or two were added and a couple were taken off, but it's about 10 sites around the world. And so it's a very interesting process that, as I said, is being followed by this museum, and they're archiving the process of science. In a sense, what we're doing is trying to be, postmodern in the sense that we're post-humanists and saying, can we actually observe our own impact on the planet in not so much an unbiased way, but can we do that? And it, in a sense, deconstructs our role as scientists and makes us more advocates for the planet, which is very interesting. And so there's a poetic, artistic component to this process. And so we're always being interviewed by these artists about how we do this. How do we decide what colors to use in that figure I showed you? How do you present this? What scale is the most important? I mean, simple things like how do we communicate what I just talked to you about, but also more complicated things like the layers and layers of knowledge that goes on top and the collaborate. I mean, this is a huge collaboration, right? We're working with USGS and scientists in the UK and in Japan. And so it's a very big endeavor. And as I said, we're a little bit competitive, and I think everybody is. But in a way, we'll always be part of this giant group, and I'll always be able to talk about the Anthropocene at Jasper Ridge, whether we are recognized as the golden spike or not.
Yeah. Well, it's brilliant. Thank you. That was delightful.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thanks for coming.
Well,
And
we're
that's-
keeping you
the cocktail.
beyond our time, Liz, so we
Okay.
want to respect that. 15 minutes late, so sorry.
No worries. I didn't even notice.
Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for
You are
coming
very
and
welcome.
giving us all your knowledge and your personality, and you're just a wonderful person. And so
Thank you, Nancy.
thank you very, very, very much. We appreciate it.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Hi, thank you,
Thanks, Nancy.
Go
You're
Giants.
Nancy.
Go Giants.
Uh, I'll be the last one to go. Oh, they're all working on it. I can go now. And delete.